The autumn of 1892 brought an early frost to the Wyoming Territory, and the small railroad town of Cedar Falls was already bracing for what promised to be the harshest winter in a decade. But nothing could have prepared the residents for what happened on that fog-shrouded October morning, when 6 brothers, ranging in age from 4 to 14, were discovered huddled together on the abandoned section of the train platform, surviving on nothing but melted snow and scraps of moldy bread they'd found in discarded lunch pails. This is the story of how one mountain man's encounter with these forgotten children would spark a transformation that reached far beyond Cedar Falls, challenging everything a struggling frontier community believed about survival, charity, and what it truly means to leave no one behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Bear Thompson had earned his nickname honestly. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, he possessed the kind of physical presence that made even seasoned lumberjacks step aside when he walked through town. His thick black beard, streaked with premature silver at the age of 35, framed a face weathered by 2 decades of mountain living. But his pale blue eyes held a gentleness that contradicted his intimidating appearance. Bear had come down from his cabin in the Bighorn Mountains for his quarterly supply run, a ritual that brought him to Cedar Falls 4 times a year, whether he needed provisions or not. The truth was, after 15 years of near-solitary living, these visits represented his only regular contact with civilization. And despite his preference for the wilderness, he found himself looking forward to the brief interactions with shopkeepers and fellow travelers. Cedar Falls in 1892 was a town caught between prosperity and decline. The Union Pacific Railroad had brought initial growth, transforming what had been a fur trapper's way station into a bustling community of nearly 800 souls. The surrounding forests provided timber, the nearby streams offered excellent fishing, and the rail connection meant that local products could reach markets in Denver and Salt Lake City. But the economic panic of 1891 had hit hard. Several major logging operations had shuttered. The silver boom in Colorado was drawing away many of the most ambitious residents, and the railroad was considering reducing service to the smaller stops along its route. What remained was a community of determined but increasingly desperate people who had invested too much in Cedar Falls to leave, but couldn't seem to find a way to make it thrive again. The October morning that would change everything began like any other for Bear Thompson. He'd made camp about 2 miles outside town the previous evening, preferring the familiar comfort of sleeping under stars to the cramped confines of the town's single boarding house. Dawn found him breaking camp methodically, packing his supplies with the precise efficiency of someone who had learned that carelessness in the wilderness could mean death. As he approached Cedar Falls, leading his pack horse through the early morning mist, Bear noticed something unusual about the train platform. The westbound freight wasn't due until afternoon, and the passenger service only ran twice a week. Yet there appeared to be figures huddled on the far end of the platform, where the old cattle loading ramp had been abandoned after the last ranch in the valley went under. At first, Bear assumed he was seeing transient workers or drifters waiting for the next train. The railroad attracted its share of wanderers, men looking for work in the logging camps or mining operations, or simply trying to get to somewhere they imagined would offer better opportunities. But as he drew closer, something about the size and posture of the figures made him pause. They were too small to be adult men, and they were clustered together in a way that suggested not just cold, but genuine distress. Bear tied his horses to the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store and walked toward the platform, his boots echoing hollowly on the wooden planks. What he discovered there would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. 6 boys, clearly brothers, judging by their similar features and the way they instinctively protected each other. were huddled beneath a torn piece of canvas that provided almost no protection from the morning chill. Their ages appeared to range from perhaps 4 to 14, and their condition told a story of abandonment and desperation that was all too familiar on the frontier. The oldest boy, thin and hollow-cheeked but alert, positioned himself between Bear's approaching figure and his younger brothers. His clothes, like those of the others, were layers of patched fabric. Worn boots with holes that let in the cold, and makeshift coverings that spoke of a family pushed far beyond its limits. "Mister," the boy said, his voice hoarse but steady, "we ain't causing no trouble. We're just waiting for our pa to come back." Bear knelt slowly, bringing his massive frame closer to the children's eye level. Even kneeling, he towered over them, but his voice when he spoke was gentle as summer rain. "What's your name, son?" "Timothy Walsh," the boy replied, his chin raised with a pride that poverty hadn't been able to break. "These are my brothers. That's Michael, he's 12. Joseph there is 10. Peter's 8, David's 6, and little Matthew just turned 4 last month." Bear studied the faces looking back at him. They showed the telltale signs of prolonged hunger. Hollow cheeks, prominent cheekbones, and the listless quality that comes when the body begins to consume its own reserves. But there was something else there too, a fierce loyalty to each other and a dignity that spoke of a family that had faced their hardships together. "How long have you boys been here?" Bear asked. Timothy glanced at his brothers before answering. "Pa left us here 3 days ago. Said he was going to Denver to find work and send for us. But the station master, Mr. Henderson, he said we couldn't stay on the platform much longer without tickets. Where's your mother, Timothy?" The boy's composure cracked slightly. "Ma died last spring. Fever took her. Pa tried to keep us all together, but work's been hard to find. He said Denver would have more opportunities." Bear felt his heart constrict as he absorbed the implications of what Timothy was telling him. These weren't just hungry children. They were abandoned ones. Whether their father had genuinely intended to return or had simply reached the point where he could no longer care for 6 children was irrelevant. What mattered was that 6 boys were slowly starving on a train platform while the adults of Cedar Falls walked past them every day. "What have you been eating?" Bear asked. Michael, the 12-year-old, spoke up. "We found some bread in the trash behind the dining car when the eastbound came through yesterday. And Joe's good at catching rainwater in that tin, can we found." Joseph nodded proudly, though his pride was tempered by the obvious weakness in his movements. "Got near a whole cup yesterday when it rained." Bear looked more closely at their makeshift shelter. The torn canvas had been rigged with remarkable ingenuity, using pieces of rope and wooden stakes they'd somehow acquired. Beneath it, the boys had created a surprisingly organized living space. Their few possessions, some extra clothes, a battered tin cup, a small knife, and what appeared to be a family Bible, were arranged neatly in one corner. But it was the evidence of their care for each other that struck Bear most powerfully. Little Matthew, barely 4 years old, was wrapped in what appeared to be shirts from his older brothers, leaving them with even less protection from the cold. Peter, despite his own obvious hunger, was carefully rationing what looked like half a hard biscuit, breaking off tiny pieces and distributing them among his brothers. "We take turns staying awake," Timothy explained, noticing Bear's attention to their arrangements. "Make sure nobody bothers Matthew, and watch for Pa in case he comes back on one of the trains." The system they developed was both heartbreaking and inspiring. These children had created their own survival network, sharing resources, protecting each other, and maintaining hope despite circumstances that would have broken many adults. But Bear could see that their resilience was nearing its limit. Matthew, the youngest, was showing signs of serious malnutrition. His movements were sluggish. His skin had an unhealthy pallor, and his eyes held the distant quality that indicated his body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions. The other boys were in various stages of the same decline, though their older ages gave them slightly more reserves. "Timothy," Bear said, "making a decision that would change not just these boys' lives, but the entire trajectory of Cedar Falls. I want you and your brothers to come with me." We're going to get you fed, warmed up, and figure out how to make sure you're properly taken care of." The oldest boy's eyes narrowed with suspicion, born of hard experience. "We don't take charity, mister. And we can't leave in case Pa comes back." Bear understood the boy's pride and his loyalty to his father, but he also understood that these children were perhaps days away from a crisis that could prove fatal. "Son, this isn't charity. It's neighbors helping neighbors. And if your Pa comes back, everyone in town will know where to find you." "We don't have any money to pay you back," Michael said quietly. "Who said anything about money?" Bear replied. "You boys have been taking care of each other, which is about the hardest job there is. That tells me you're the kind of people worth knowing." For several long moments, the brothers exchanged glances, conducting the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who have only each other to rely on. Finally, Timothy nodded slowly. "We appreciate the offer, Mr. Thompson." "Samuel Thompson. But folks call me Bear." "Mr. Bear," Timothy said formally, "we'll accept your help. But we want to work for whatever you give us. We ain't looking for handouts." As Bear helped the boys gather their meager possessions, he found himself marveling at their resilience and dignity. These children had faced abandonment and starvation with more grace than many adults he'd known. They had created a family structure that protected their most vulnerable member and maintained hope in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. But as they walked toward Murphy's general store, Bear began to realize that helping these 6 boys would require more than just buying them a meal. They needed not just immediate relief, but a long-term solution that would give them stability, education, and the chance to grow into the remarkable adults their current behavior suggested they could become. The town of Cedar Falls was about to be tested in ways it had never experienced before, challenged to decide whether it was the kind of community that could nurture abandoned children, or whether it would allow them to slip through the cracks of frontier indifference. Bear Thompson had made his decision. Now he had to convince an entire town to make theirs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bell above Murphy's general store chimed as Bear Thompson pushed through the door, the 6 Walsh brothers trailing behind him like uncertain shadows. The warmth inside hit them immediately, and Bear watched as little Matthew swayed on his feet, overwhelmed by the sudden change from the October chill. Agnes Murphy looked up from her ledger, her steel-grey hair pulled back in its customary bun, her sharp eyes taking in the unusual sight. At 55, Agnes had run the general store for nearly 2 decades since her husband's death in a logging accident, and she prided herself on knowing every resident of Cedar Falls and most of their business. These children were strangers, which in a town of 800 people was immediately noteworthy. "Morning, Bear," she said, her voice carrying the cautious friendliness she reserved for customers who might actually have money to spend. "Back for supplies already?" "Morning, Mrs. Murphy," Bear replied, his deep voice gentle as he guided Timothy forward. "I'd like you to meet the Walsh brothers. Boys, this is Mrs. Murphy. She runs the finest general store in 3 counties. Agnes studied the children with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of hardship on the frontier. Their condition was immediately obvious. The hollow cheeks, the carefully patched clothes, the way they stayed close together like animals seeking warmth. But what struck her most was their cleanliness, despite their obvious poverty, and the way the older boys positioned themselves protectively around the younger ones. "Walsh," she repeated slowly. "Don't recall any Walsh family in these parts. They're not from here originally," Bear explained. "Been waiting on the train platform for their father. I thought they might appreciate a hot meal and somewhere warm to rest while we sort things out." Before Agnes could respond, the store's door burst open with enough force to set the bell jangling frantically. Ezra Caldwell, Cedar Falls' self-appointed moral authority and chairman of the town council, strode in with the purposeful gait of a man on a mission. At 42, Caldwell was a thin, angular man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of perpetual frown that suggested he found most of the world lacking in proper standards. Thompson. Caldwell's voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What's this I hear about you collecting strays from the train platform?" Bear turned slowly, his massive frame seeming to grow even larger as he faced Caldwell. "These are children, Ezra, not strays. Vagrant children," Caldwell corrected, his eyes scanning the Walsh brothers with undisguised disapproval. "Abandoned by their own family, by all accounts. We can't have every drifter's offspring camping on our property and expecting the town to support them." Timothy stepped forward, his young face flushing with anger, despite his obvious weakness. "We ain't vagrants, mister. Our pa's coming back for us. He just went to Denver for work." Caldwell's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Son, I've heard that story 100 times. Parents who go looking for work and never come back. Cedar Falls can't become a dumping ground for every family's unwanted burdens." The words hit the brothers like physical blows. Bear watched as Michael's hands clenched into fists, as Joseph's face crumpled before he forced it back into stoic lines. As little Matthew moved closer to Timothy for protection he didn't fully understand was needed. "That's enough," Bear said, his voice carrying a warning that made even Caldwell take a step back. "These boys have done nothing to deserve your hostility, and what exactly do you propose we do with them?" Caldwell demanded. "Feed them, house them, educate them? On whose authority? With what resources? This town is barely keeping its own families fed, and you want us to take on 6 more mouths." Agnes Murphy, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke up. "Ezra Caldwell, those are children you're talking about. Whatever their circumstances, they're human beings who deserve basic decency. Decency doesn't put food on tables or pay for shelter," Caldwell snapped. "This town operates on practical considerations, not sentimental gestures. If word gets out that Cedar Falls takes in every abandoned child, we'll be overrun." Bear felt his temper rising, but a quick glance at the Walsh brothers reminded him that an argument wouldn't serve their immediate needs. Timothy was swaying slightly on his feet, and little Matthew was clearly struggling to stay upright. Whatever philosophical debates needed to happen could wait until these children were fed and rested. "Mrs. Murphy," Bear said, turning away from Caldwell deliberately, "I'd like to purchase some bread, cheese, milk, and whatever other provisions you think would be suitable for growing boys. I'll also need to arrange for temporary lodging." "Now see here, Thompson," Caldwell began, but Bear cut him off with a look that could have frozen the Wyoming wind. "I'm a paying customer. Ezra, my money spends the same as anyone else's. These boys are under my protection now, which makes them my responsibility, not the town's." Agnes began gathering items from her shelves. Her movements quick and efficient. Bear noticed she was selecting higher quality goods than he'd requested: thick slices of ham, fresh bread that was clearly from that morning's baking, a wheel of aged cheese that was usually reserved for her wealthiest customers. "The boarding house is full up," Caldwell said, clearly hoping to create an obstacle. "Mrs. Patterson's got 3 families already, more than the building was meant to hold." "Then we'll make other arrangements," Bear replied calmly. He turned to Timothy. "How do you boys feel about camping? I've got equipment that could keep you comfortable until we figure out something more permanent." "We're used to sleeping rough," Timothy answered, though Bear could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "Long as we can stay together." "That's exactly what I had in mind." As Agnes tallied up Bear's purchases, her adding machine clicking steadily, Dr. William Harrison entered the store. The town's physician was a gentleman in his early 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the soft-spoken manner that came from years of delivering both good and bad news to frontier families. "Morning, folks," Dr. Harrison said, then paused as he took in the scene. His medical training immediately recognized the signs of malnutrition and exposure in the Walsh brothers. "Are these children in need of medical attention?" "They've been living rough for several days," Bear explained. "Could use a proper examination." Dr. Harrison nodded, already moving toward the boys. "Of course. Why don't we head over to my office after they've had something to eat? Absolutely not, Caldwell interjected. Dr. Harrison, I won't have you wasting your time on charity cases when paying patients might need your services. The physician straightened, his mild manner hardening slightly. Ezra, I took an oath to help the sick and injured. I don't recall any exceptions for patients who can't pay. Fine sentiment, Caldwell replied, but this town needs practical leadership, not bleeding hearts. These children are not our responsibility. Their father abandoned them, and we have no obligation to clean up his mess. Michael Walsh, who had been silently listening to the adults debate their fate as if they weren't present, finally spoke up. Mister, you keep saying our pa abandoned us, but you don't know nothing about our family. Pa worked double shifts in the lumber mill until it closed. He tried the mines, but they weren't hiring new men. He sold near everything we owned, trying to keep us fed and housed. The 12-year-old's voice grew stronger as he continued. When Ma got sick, Pa spent every penny we had on medicine. After she died, he kept trying to find work, but nobody wanted to hire a man with 6 kids to worry about. Going to Denver wasn't abandoning us. It was the only chance he had to make enough money to keep us. Together, the store fell silent except for the ticking of Agnes's clock and the soft whisper of wind through the building's wooden joints. Michael's defense of his father carried the ring of truth, and even Caldwell seemed momentarily unsure of his position. Joseph, the 10-year-old, added quietly, Pa cried when he left us. Said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he'd starve before he'd let us starve. Little Matthew, tired of standing and confused by the adults' argument, tugged on Timothy's sleeve. Timmy, when's Pa coming back? I'm hungry. The simple, innocent question broke something in the room's tension. Bear knelt down and scooped Matthew up, the child's weight alarmingly light in his arms. We're going to get you fed right now, little man. Mrs. Murphy's got some fine bread and milk with your name on it. Agnes had finished calculating Bear's bill, and the total was substantial. Nearly $20, which represented more than many families in Cedar Falls spent on provisions in a month. But Bear paid without hesitation, his mining and trapping ventures having provided him with resources that his simple lifestyle rarely required him to use. There's a room above the store, Agnes said quietly as Bear counted out the money. Haven't used it since my nephew moved to California. It's got beds and a stove. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and clean. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. Agnes, you can't be seriously considering my store, my decision. She cut him off firmly. These children need shelter, and I've got space sitting empty. Seems like simple arithmetic to me. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, addressing the Walsh brothers directly for the first time. Boys, I'd like to examine each of you to make sure you're healthy. Nothing invasive. Just checking that you haven't suffered any serious effects from your recent hardships. Timothy looked at his brothers, then at Bear, clearly weighing their options. Will it cost money we don't have? My services today are free, Dr. Harrison assured him. Community obligation. There's no such thing as community obligation to strangers, Caldwell protested, but his voice carried less conviction than before. The Walsh brothers' dignity and their obvious love for each other had begun to affect even him, though he fought against admitting it. Bear looked around the store, taking in the faces of the adults who would help determine these children's future. Agnes Murphy, stern but clearly sympathetic. Dr. Harrison, already committed to helping regardless of payment. Ezra Caldwell, whose objections seemed based more on fear than malice. Fear that helping these children would set a precedent the town couldn't sustain. Ezra, Bear said finally, I understand your concerns about the town's resources. You're right that Cedar Falls has its own struggles. But answer me this, what kind of place do we want this to be? The kind that turns away hungry children, or the kind that finds ways to help when help is needed? Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, his stern expression wavering slightly as he looked at little Matthew sleeping in Bear's arms, and at the other boys who were clearly fighting exhaustion and hunger while trying to maintain their dignity. It's not about what kind of place we want to be, he said finally. It's about what kind of place we can afford to be. Good intentions don't pay for food or shelter or medical care. Then let's figure out how to afford it, Bear replied. Between my resources and the goodwill of folks like Mrs. Murphy and Dr. Harrison, I think we can manage 6 boys. And I have a feeling these boys might surprise you with what they can contribute once they're back on their feet. As if to prove Bear's point, Timothy straightened despite his obvious exhaustion. Mr. Thompson's right. We're not looking for handouts. We can work. All of us except maybe Matthew. We know how to chop wood, tend animals, help with farming. We've been taking care of ourselves since Ma died, and doing a fine job of it, Dr. Harrison observed. The fact that you've survived what you have and kept your family together shows remarkable character. Bear felt a spark of hope as he watched the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The Walsh brothers weren't just objects of pity. They were individuals with skills, determination, and the kind of family loyalty that frontier communities valued above almost everything else. But he also knew that Caldwell's objections represented the views of many Cedar Falls residents. Convincing one man would be just the beginning of a much larger challenge, proving to an entire community that helping these children wasn't just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. The real test would come when word spread through town that Bear Thompson had taken responsibility for 6 abandoned children, and the community would have to decide whether to support his decision or resist it. Dr. William Harrison's medical office occupied the ground floor of a modest 2-story building on Cedar Falls Main Street, its windows facing west to catch the afternoon light that was essential for detailed examinations. The waiting area was sparse but clean, with 3 wooden chairs and a small table holding outdated medical journals from Denver and Chicago. The examination room beyond was Dr. Harrison's pride, equipped with the most modern instruments available on the frontier, including a recently acquired stethoscope and a set of surgical tools that had cost him nearly a month's income. Bear Thompson sat in the largest chair, which creaked ominously under his weight, while the 6 Walsh brothers arranged themselves around the small room. Timothy and Michael flanked the younger boys protectively, their eyes taking in every detail of the unfamiliar medical equipment with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Now then," Dr. Harrison said, washing his hands in a basin of clean water, "I'd like to examine each of you individually. Nothing painful, just checking your general health. Timothy, as the eldest, would you like to go first and show your brothers there's nothing to worry about?" Timothy nodded, though Bear could see the teenager's hands trembling slightly. At 14, Timothy had likely never seen a doctor. Medical care was a luxury most frontier families couldn't afford unless someone was dying. And sometimes not even then. "Have you ever been to a physician before, son?" Dr. Harrison asked gently as Timothy settled onto the examination table. "No, sir. Ma used to say doctors cost more than we could afford, and she knew enough about healing to handle most troubles." Dr. Harrison nodded understandingly. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. Many frontier wives know more about practical medicine than doctors who learned from books. Now I'm going to listen to your heart and lungs with this instrument." He held up the stethoscope. "It might be cold, but it won't hurt." As Dr. Harrison conducted his examination, Bear watched the other boys observe their brother's experience. Joseph and Peter leaned forward with fascination, clearly intrigued by the medical instruments. David sat closer to little Matthew, whispering reassurances in his ear. Michael remained alert and protective, ready to intervene if anything seemed to threaten Timothy. "Breathe deeply for me, Timothy," Dr. Harrison instructed. "Good, again, excellent." The examination continued methodically. Dr. Harrison checked Timothy's reflexes, examined his throat and ears, and felt for swollen glands. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Bear caught the slight tightening around his eyes when he noted Timothy's obvious malnutrition. "How long has it been since you've had a proper meal, son?" Timothy considered the question carefully. "Day before yesterday we found some bread. Before that, maybe 2 days. We've been making what we have last as long as possible, and before your father left for Denver. Pa did his best to keep us fed, but work's been scarce since the mill closed." Sometimes we'd have potatoes and maybe some beans. On good days, there might be a bit of meat. Dr. Harrison made notes on a pad of paper, his handwriting neat and precise. Any illnesses recently? Fevers, stomach troubles, unusual fatigue? We've all been tired a lot, Timothy admitted. And Matthew's been having bad dreams, crying at night. Joe's been complaining about headaches. That's to be expected given your circumstances, Dr. Harrison said kindly. Hunger and stress affect the body in many ways. The good news is that I don't see any signs of serious illness, just the effects of insufficient nutrition and exposure to cold. He turned to address the other boys. Who would like to go next? Michael volunteered, and his examination revealed similar findings, malnutrition and exhaustion, but no underlying health problems. Dr. Harrison was particularly impressed by the 12-year-old's questions about the medical instruments and procedures. Are you interested in medicine, Michael? Yes, sir. Ma taught me some things about herbs and treating cuts and fevers. I always wondered how doctors in big cities did things different. Well, the principles are often the same. Clean wounds, reduce fevers, help the body heal itself. The main difference is that we have better tools and more knowledge about what causes illness. As the examinations continued, Dr. Harrison discovered that each boy had his own interests and capabilities. Joseph showed remarkable mathematical ability when asked to count backwards and perform simple calculations. Peter demonstrated an unusual understanding of mechanical principles when Dr. Harrison explained how the stethoscope worked. David revealed artistic talent when he accurately sketched one of the medical instruments from memory, but it was little Matthew's examination that proved most concerning. The 4-year-old was clearly the most affected by their recent hardships. He was underweight even for his small frame. His reflexes were slightly sluggish, and he showed signs of the kind of developmental delays that malnutrition could cause in young children. Matthew needs immediate and consistent nutrition. Dr. Harrison told Bear quietly while the boy was distracted by a picture book Timothy had found. At his age, prolonged malnutrition can have lasting effects on both physical and mental development. He's not in immediate danger, but time is important, Bear nodded grimly. What does he need specifically? Regular meals with adequate protein and vitamins. Milk, eggs, meat when possible. Fresh vegetables if you can get them. And most importantly, he needs stability, knowing that food will be available consistently so his body can stop operating in survival mode. What about the others? They're more resilient due to their ages, but they all need proper nutrition and rest. Timothy and Michael are both undernourished for their developmental stage. With proper care, they should recover completely, but they need time and resources. As Dr. Harrison completed his examinations and compiled his notes, word of Bear's involvement with the Walsh brothers had begun spreading through Cedar Falls. The frontier telegraph system, meaning gossip, spread by women at the general store and men at the saloon, was already carrying news of the mountain man who had taken responsibility for 6 abandoned children. The responses were mixed and immediate. Martha Webb, who ran the town's small restaurant, sent her daughter Lucy with a pot of beef stew and fresh biscuits. Ma says growing boys need proper food, 10-year-old Lucy explained as she carefully carried the heavy pot up the stairs to the room above Murphy's store. But resistance was also building. A group of town councilmen had gathered at Peterson's saloon to discuss what they saw as a dangerous precedent. Led by Ezra Caldwell and joined by banker Harold Morrison, shopkeeper Frank Peterson, and rancher Bill Crawford, they were formulating arguments about why the community couldn't afford to support what they viewed as an unsustainable charity case. It's not about the children themselves, Caldwell was saying as he nursed a whiskey. It's about what happens when word gets out that Cedar Falls takes in every abandoned child. We'll have families dumping their unwanted offspring here from 3 territories away. Harold Morrison, who managed the town's small bank and considered himself an expert on financial matters, nodded gravely. The economics simply don't work. 6 children require food, clothing, shelter, education. We're talking about hundreds of dollars in expenses over the next several years. Money this town doesn't have. And what happens when Thompson gets tired of playing benefactor?" added Frank Peterson. "He's a mountain man, not a family man. Once the novelty wears off, he'll head back to his cabin and we'll be stuck with the responsibility." Bill Crawford, whose ranch lay just outside town, brought a different perspective. "Boys that age could be useful workers if they're properly directed. Frontier life has always depended on everyone contributing. Question is whether they're willing to work or just looking for handouts." The debate at Peterson's saloon represented the broader tensions that Bear's decision had unleashed. Cedar Falls was a community balanced precariously between survival and prosperity, where every resource had to be carefully allocated and every decision carried long-term consequences. Meanwhile, in Dr. Harrison's office, a different kind of evaluation was taking place. The physician had completed his medical assessments, but he was also observing the boy's character and capabilities. What he saw impressed him significantly. "Bear," he said as they prepared to leave, "these aren't just 6 children in need of rescue. They're 6 individuals with distinct talents and strong moral character. Timothy shows natural leadership abilities. Michael has genuine intellectual curiosity. Joseph demonstrates mathematical thinking. Peter has mechanical aptitude. David shows artistic sensitivity. And little Matthew, despite his current struggles, clearly has a strong emotional bond with his brothers that suggests resilience." "You're saying they could contribute to the community?" "I'm saying they could enrich it significantly if given proper opportunities. But that requires people to see beyond their current circumstances to their potential." As they walked back toward Murphy's store, Bear found himself thinking about Dr. Harrison's observations. The physician was right. These weren't just children to be fed and housed, but individuals who could become valuable community members if properly supported and educated. But first, they had to survive the immediate challenges. As they approached the general store, Bear could see through the windows that a crowd had gathered inside. Agnes Murphy was behind her counter, arms crossed defensively, while several town residents gestured animatedly. The heated discussion was audible even through the glass. "Looks like our arrival has stirred up more than just sympathy," Bear observed. Timothy, walking beside him, squared his shoulders with the same determination Bear had noticed on the train platform. "Mr. Bear, are we going to be trouble for you? Because if folks don't want us here, maybe we should move on." Bear stopped walking and knelt down so he was eye level with the 14-year-old. "Son, the only trouble you boys represent is the trouble of challenging this community to live up to its better nature. Sometimes that's exactly the kind of trouble a place needs." As they approached the store, where the community was debating their fate, Bear realized that his decision to help the Walsh brothers had set in motion something much larger than a simple rescue. Cedar Falls was about to discover what kind of community it really was, and what kind of community it wanted to become. The medical examinations had revealed not just the boys' physical needs, but their individual strengths and potential. Now came the harder test, convincing a frontier town to invest in that potential rather than simply seeing 6 children as burdens to be borne. The real examination was just beginning, and it would test not the Walsh brothers' health, but Cedar Falls' character. The crowd inside Murphy's general store had grown to nearly 20 people by the time Bear and the Walsh brothers returned from Dr. Harrison's office. What had begun as casual conversation among afternoon shoppers had evolved into something approaching a town meeting, with Agnes Murphy's store serving as an impromptu venue for Cedar Falls' first real debate about community responsibility in over a decade. Ezra Caldwell stood near the counter, his thin frame rigid with authority as he addressed the assembled residents. "The question before us isn't whether these children deserve help," he was saying, his voice carrying the measured tones of a practiced speaker. "The question is whether our community can afford to set a precedent that will attract every abandoned child from here to the Pacific Ocean." "That's a mighty cold way to talk about 6 boys who haven't done anything wrong," replied Sarah Martinez, the town's schoolteacher. At 28, Sarah was one of the few college-educated women in Cedar Falls, having come west from Ohio to establish the territory's educational standards. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but her dark eyes flashed with passionate conviction. These children need education, not just basic survival. Every child deserves the chance to learn and grow. Harold Morrison, the banker, shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit that set him apart from the working clothes worn by most residents. Miss Martinez, your sentiments are admirable, but education costs money. Books, supplies, additional classroom space. We're talking about significant expenses at a time when the town can barely maintain existing services. What services? Demanded Tom Fletcher, a burly blacksmith whose forge provided essential metalwork for the community. Half our businesses are barely hanging on, the railroad's threatening to reduce service, and we're arguing about whether to help 6 hungry children. What kind of people have we become? The conversation paused as Bear pushed through the door, little Matthew still sleeping in his arms, while the other boys followed quietly behind. The sight of the children seemed to shift the tone of the debate, making abstract arguments about resources and precedents suddenly concrete and personal. "Thompson," Caldwell said, his voice taking on a more formal edge, "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss the implications of your generous gesture." Bear set Matthew down gently, the 4-year-old immediately moving to stand beside Timothy. "What implications would those be, Ezra?" "The financial burden, for starters," Harold Morrison interjected, pulling out a small notebook filled with calculations. "I've been estimating the costs. Food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education. We're looking at approximately $300 per year for 6 children. That's nearly 10% of the town's entire annual budget, assuming the town pays for it," Bear replied calmly. "Which I never suggested." The statement caught several people off guard. Caldwell frowned, clearly having expected Bear to request community support. "You're saying you'll personally cover all expenses?" "I'm saying I'll cover what needs covering. But I suspect these boys will be contributing more than they consume once people give them a chance." Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her teacher's instincts engaged. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to assess these children's educational levels. If they're going to attend school, I need to know where they stand academically." "We can read and write," Timothy said quietly, speaking for his brothers. "Ma taught us from the Bible and some books she had. Michael's real good with numbers, and Joe knows his times tables better than most grown folks. Our Ma was a teacher back in Pennsylvania before she married Pa," Michael added, pride evident in his voice despite their circumstances. "She made sure we kept up with our lessons, even when times got hard." This revelation seemed to surprise several adults. Children with educational backgrounds were valuable assets in frontier communities, where literacy was often rare and mathematical skills desperately needed. "Pennsylvania," mused Dr. Harrison, who had quietly entered during the conversation. "That suggests formal schooling before your family moved west. What brought your parents to Wyoming?" "Pa heard there was good work in the timber industry," Joseph answered. "Ma wasn't keen on leaving her family, but Pa said the frontier offered opportunities for people willing to work hard." "And they were right," said Martha Webb, who had arrived to check on whether the boys had received her stew. "This territory needs families with strong values and good work ethics. Seems to me these boys represent exactly what Cedar Falls should be encouraging." But not everyone shared Martha's optimism. Bill Crawford, the rancher whose spread lay just outside town, raised practical concerns that resonated with many residents. "Work ethic's fine, but what kind of work can children do? The oldest boy there can't be more than 14. That's 4 more years before he's old enough for real labor. And meanwhile, we're feeding and housing 6 people who can't contribute much to the community's economic base." "With respect, Mr. Crawford," Timothy said, his voice carrying a maturity that surprised the adults, "we've been working since we were old enough to hold tools. We know farming, animal care, wood chopping, and general labor. We're not looking for charity, we're looking for opportunity to prove ourselves." Bear watched the interplay of opinions with growing understanding of the community's dynamics. Cedar Falls was a town caught between its frontier pragmatism and its civilized aspirations. The residents who supported helping the Walsh brothers weren't just being charitable. They were expressing a vision of what kind of community they wanted to build. Those who opposed it weren't necessarily heartless. They were protecting what they saw as the town's survival interests. Perhaps, Bear suggested, we could arrange a trial period. Give these boys a chance to demonstrate their value to the community while ensuring they receive proper care and education. If they prove to be assets rather than burdens, then the arrangement becomes permanent, and if they don't, Caldwell asked pointedly, then I'll relocate them to a community better suited to their needs, Bear replied. Though privately, he had no intention of abandoning the boys, regardless of Cedar Falls' decision. Sarah Martinez had been studying the Walsh brothers during the adult conversation, noting their attentiveness, their protective instincts toward each other, and their respectful but confident manner of speaking. I'd like to propose an immediate assessment, she said. Let me work with these boys for a week. I'll evaluate their academic abilities, their learning potential, and their capacity to integrate into our school system. At what cost? Morrison demanded. At no additional cost, Sarah replied firmly. It's part of my responsibility as an educator to assess new students. If these children can benefit from education and contribute to our classroom environment, then the investment in their schooling will pay dividends to the entire community. The suggestion seemed reasonable to most residents, though Caldwell remained skeptical. And who determines whether they've passed this assessment? Who decides if they're suitable for permanent placement in our community? We all do, suggested Tom Fletcher. This is a small enough town that everyone will see how these boys conduct themselves. If they work hard, behave respectfully, and contribute to community life, I think most folks will support keeping them. If they cause problems or prove lazy, then we reconsider. Agnes Murphy, who had been listening from behind her counter while tallying inventory, finally spoke up. I'll tell you what I've seen so far. These boys have been polite, grateful, and protective of each other. They cleaned up after themselves in the room upstairs without being asked. The youngest one said please and thank you for a glass of water. If these are problem children, I'd like to see more problems like them. Her endorsement carried significant weight. Agnes Murphy was known for her sharp judgment and no-nonsense approach to business. If she vouched for the boy's character, many residents would take that seriously. Dr. Harrison added his professional perspective. From a medical standpoint, these children are remarkably healthy considering their recent hardships. More importantly, they show strong family bonds and mutual support systems that suggest psychological resilience. With proper nutrition and stability, they should thrive. But what about the precedent? Caldwell persisted. If word spreads that Cedar Falls accepts abandoned children, what's to stop other families from dumping their unwanted offspring here? Little Matthew, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, tugged on Bear's sleeve. Mr. Bear, he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, why does that man keep saying we're unwanted? Pa wanted us. He just couldn't take care of us right now. The innocent question silenced the room. Caldwell's face reddened as he realized how his arguments sounded from a child's perspective. Several residents shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own prejudices in the 4-year-old's confusion. Bear knelt down to Matthew's level. Some grown-ups worry about things that might happen instead of focusing on what's actually happening. Mr. Caldwell isn't mean, he's just trying to protect the town by thinking about problems that could come up. But we're not problems, Matthew said with the absolute certainty of childhood. We're just boys who need somewhere to live until Pa comes back. You're absolutely right, Bear replied, then stood to address the room. This child has just stated the situation more clearly than any of us adults have managed. These aren't abstract policy questions we're debating. These are 6 specific boys who need help right now. Whatever broader implications our decision might have can be addressed if and when they arise. Sarah Martinez nodded approvingly. Mr. Thompson is right. We're overthinking this. We have 6 children who need immediate assistance, and we have the resources to provide it. Our obligation is to help them, not to solve every hypothetical problem that might result from helping them." The debate continued for another hour, but the momentum had shifted in favor of supporting the Walsh brothers. Martha Webb offered part-time work for Timothy and Michael at her restaurant. Tom Fletcher suggested that the older boys could help at his blacksmith shop, learning useful trades while earning small wages. Even Harold Morrison grudgingly admitted that the bank could use assistance with filing and basic bookkeeping, work that might suit Joseph's mathematical abilities. As the meeting wound down, Caldwell made one final attempt to voice his concerns. "I want it understood that I'm not opposed to helping these children personally. My objection is to committing community resources without proper planning or oversight. Then help us plan properly," Bear suggested. "You're chairman of the town council. Work with us to create a framework that protects both the boys' interests and the community's concerns." Caldwell considered this for a moment, perhaps recognizing an opportunity to maintain some control over the situation. "Very well. I propose we establish a formal guardianship arrangement with clear expectations and regular reviews. If the boys demonstrate that they can contribute positively to community life, then we continue the arrangement. If not, we reconsider." "Agreed," Bear said, extending his massive hand, "with the understanding that any assessment will be fair and based on realistic expectations for children their ages." As the crowd began to disperse, the Walsh brothers found themselves surrounded by residents offering various forms of assistance and welcome. The transition from objects of debate to welcomed community members wasn't complete, but it had begun. Timothy looked up at Bear with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Mr. Bear, we won't let you down. We'll prove we belong here." "Son," Bear replied, "you've already proven that. Now you just get to live it." The town meeting had ended with a tentative agreement, but Bear knew the real test was just beginning. Cedar Falls had agreed to give the Walsh brothers a chance, but earning permanent acceptance would require the boys to navigate the complex social dynamics of a small frontier community while demonstrating their value as future citizens. The stage was set for either a remarkable success story or a painful lesson in the limits of community compassion. Dawn came early to Cedar Falls on the morning after the town meeting, and the Walsh brothers were already awake when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of their room above Murphy's store. Timothy had established a routine during their days on the train platform that he maintained even in their new circumstances: rise before dawn, check that all his brothers were safe and well, then plan the day's activities. Bear Thompson arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying a sack of fresh clothes that Agnes Murphy had helped him select from her store's inventory. The boys were sitting around the small table, sharing a breakfast of bread and milk that Martha Webb had sent over, their conversation quiet but animated. "Morning, boys," Bear said, noting how much healthier they looked after just one night of proper rest and nutrition. "Ready for your first day as Cedar Falls residents?" "Yes, sir," Timothy replied, speaking for his brothers as usual. "We've been talking about how to make sure we prove ourselves. We don't want to disappoint anyone who's taking a chance on us." Bear was struck by the 14-year-old's sense of responsibility. Most boys his age would be excited about new clothes and steady meals. Timothy was worried about living up to adult expectations. "Son, the best way to prove yourselves is to just be yourselves. The qualities that got you through the hard times are the same ones that will serve you well here." Michael, freshly washed and wearing clean clothes for the first time in weeks, raised a question that had been troubling him. "Mr. Bear, what if our PA comes back and we're not at the train station? How will he find us?" Bear had anticipated this concern. "I've spoken with the station master, Mr. Henderson. He knows exactly where you are, and he has instructions to bring your father directly here if he returns. We've also left word at the hotel and with the sheriff. Your pa will find you." The reassurance seemed to comfort all the boys, though Bear privately doubted that their father would return. Men who abandoned children at train stations, whatever their original intentions, rarely came back. But these boys needed hope, and he saw no reason to destroy it unless circumstances forced the issue. Their first stop was Sarah Martinez's schoolhouse, a one-room building that served all of Cedar Falls' school-aged children. Sarah had arrived early to prepare assessment materials for the Walsh brothers, determined to give them a fair evaluation while also protecting the interests of her existing students. "Good morning, boys," Sarah said as they filed into the classroom. "I've prepared some exercises to help me understand your current academic levels. Nothing difficult, just reading, writing, and arithmetic problems that will show me where you fit in our curriculum." The schoolhouse contained 12 desks arranged in 4 rows, with a large slate board at the front, and shelves lined with the precious few textbooks that comprise Cedar Falls' educational resources. 8 other children were already present, ranging in age from 6 to 15, all studying the newcomers with unconcealed curiosity. "Class," Sarah announced, "I'd like you to meet the Walsh brothers. Timothy, Michael, Joseph, Peter, David, and Matthew will be joining us, while Miss Martinez evaluates their academic progress." The introductions proceeded awkwardly, as frontier children tended to be both shy around strangers and protective of their established social hierarchies. But Sarah had experience managing classroom dynamics, and she quickly set the boys to work on their assessments while engaging her regular students in their daily lessons. The results were remarkable. Timothy demonstrated reading skills equivalent to students 2 years older, while his handwriting showed the careful precision of someone who had been taught by an educated parent. Michael's mathematical abilities were extraordinary for a 12-year-old. He solved problems in his head that other children needed, slates and chalk to work through. Joseph's assessment revealed not just competence, but genuine love of learning. He asked thoughtful questions about the reading passages and showed curiosity about subjects beyond the basic curriculum. Peter and David, despite their younger ages, were clearly ahead of most frontier children in both literacy and numeracy. Even little Matthew, working with picture books and simple letter recognition exercises, showed signs of the educational foundation their mother had provided. "Remarkable," Sarah murmured to Bear as she reviewed the boys' work during the lunch break. "These children have received better early education than most of my students. Their mother must have been an exceptional teacher. What does this mean for their placement in your classroom?" "It means they'll be assets rather than burdens," Sarah replied. "Timothy could help me with the younger children. Michael's mathematical skills could benefit the entire class if he's willing to assist other students. And all of them show the kind of intellectual curiosity that makes teaching a joy rather than a chore." But academic ability was only one test the Walsh brothers would face that day. Their afternoon assignment took them to Tom Fletcher's blacksmith shop, where they would learn whether their claims about work ethic matched reality. Tom Fletcher was a man who judged people by their actions rather than their words. At 45, he had built Cedar Falls' most successful business through a combination of superior craftsmanship and absolute reliability. His forge provided essential metalwork for ranchers, farmers and townspeople throughout the region, and he had little patience for anyone who couldn't meet his exacting standards. "Boys," Tom said as they gathered around his forge, "blacksmithing isn't just about making horseshoes and door hinges. It's about understanding how heat and force change metal, how to create tools that will last for decades, and how to solve problems that other people can't figure out." He handed Timothy a piece of iron and a hammer. "Show me how you'd straighten this bent rod." Timothy studied the metal carefully, testing its flexibility and examining the nature of the bend. Rather than immediately attacking it with the hammer, he asked, "Should I heat it first, sir?" "Ma always said to think before acting when working with tools." Tom's weathered face creased into the first smile the boys had seen from him. "Your ma was a wise woman. Yes, heat it first. But tell me why." "Because cold metal might crack if you force it too hard, but hot metal will bend where you want it to go." "Exactly right. Michael, help your brother with the bellows while I show him how to judge the right temperature." The lesson continued for 2 hours, with each boy taking turns at different tasks. Tom was impressed not just by their willingness to work, but by their attention to safety, their careful observation of his demonstrations, and their thoughtful questions about the craft. Peter showed particular aptitude for the technical aspects of blacksmithing, understanding intuitively how different metals behaved under various conditions. David demonstrated artistic sensibility, asking about decorative ironwork he'd seen on buildings around town. Even little Matthew proved useful, organizing tools and keeping the work area clean. "These boys have potential," Tom told Bear as the afternoon session concluded. "Timothy has natural leadership and good judgment. Michael learns fast and isn't afraid to ask questions. The younger ones show real interest and ability. With proper training, any of them could become skilled craftsmen. Are you offering to provide that training?" Tom considered the question carefully. "I'm offering to let them prove themselves. If they show up on time, work hard, and follow instructions, I'll teach them what they need to know. But I won't coddle them or make excuses for poor performance." Their final test came at Martha Webb's restaurant, where Timothy and Michael would learn whether they could handle the social pressures of serving Cedar Falls residents while representing their family with dignity. Martha's restaurant occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building near the train station, its windows offering views of the platform where the boys had been discovered just days earlier. The dining room contained 8 tables and a counter that seated 12, serving as the social center for many of the town's business discussions and community gatherings. "Boys," Martha explained as she showed them around the kitchen, "working in a restaurant means more than just carrying plates and cleaning tables. You represent this establishment to every customer. How you conduct yourselves reflects on me, on your family, and on this entire community." Timothy nodded seriously. "We understand, ma'am. We won't embarrass you or Mr. Bear." "I'm not worried about embarrassment," Martha replied. "I'm concerned about whether you can handle the pressure of dealing with people who might not be sympathetic to your situation. Some customers will test you, trying to see if you're weak or unreliable." She was proven right within the first hour. Silas Morton, a cantankerous rancher known for his sharp tongue and difficult personality, arrived for his usual afternoon coffee and immediately focused his attention on the new workers. "So these are Thompson's charity cases," Morton said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Let's see if they know how to work, or if they're just looking for handouts." Timothy approached the table with coffee and a steady expression. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like to see today's menu? What I'd like is service from people who've earned their place here instead of having it handed to them," Morton replied, his voice deliberately provocative. Michael, who was clearing a nearby table, paused in his work. Bear, sitting across the room, tensed slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. But Timothy's response surprised everyone. "Sir, I understand your concern. If I were you, I'd want to know that new people in town were worth the investment. What would you like me to do to earn your confidence?" Morton had clearly expected either an angry response or cowering submission. Timothy's calm professionalism caught him off guard. "Well, I suppose you could start by getting my coffee hot instead of lukewarm." "Yes, sir. Let me get you a fresh cup right away." Timothy returned with steaming coffee and Martha's best apple pie. "Mrs. Webb suggested you might enjoy this pie. She says it's your favorite." The simple gesture, combined with Timothy's respectful manner, seemed to deflate Morton's hostility. "Well, I suppose the boy knows how to listen. Coffee's hot enough, I guess." By the end of their shift, both Timothy and Michael had won over several initially skeptical customers through a combination of hard work, politeness, and genuine interest in doing their jobs well. Martha was clearly pleased with their performance. "Those boys handled themselves better than some adults I've employed," she told Bear as the day ended. "They're respectful, hard-working, and smart enough to diffuse difficult situations without causing problems." As the Walsh brothers gathered in their room that evening, exhausted but proud of their accomplishments, Bear reflected on how much they had achieved in just one day. They had proven their academic abilities, demonstrated work skills, and shown that they could represent themselves with dignity under pressure. But he also knew that one successful day didn't guarantee long-term acceptance. The real test would come over weeks and months. As the novelty wore off, and the boys had to maintain their high standards while navigating the complex social dynamics of a small frontier community. Timothy, as always, seemed to understand the challenges ahead. "Mr. Bear," he said as his brothers prepared for sleep, "today went well, but we know some people are still watching to see if we fail. We won't give them that satisfaction." "Son," Bear replied, "the people worth impressing aren't watching for you to fail. They're hoping for you to succeed. Focus on them and let the others come around in their own time." As he headed back to his own lodgings, Bear felt cautiously optimistic about the Walsh brothers' future in Cedar Falls. They had passed their first tests admirably, but he knew that bigger challenges lay ahead. Challenges that would test not just their individual abilities, but the community's commitment to the principles they had agreed to uphold. The boys had proven they belonged in Cedar Falls. Now the town would have to prove it deserved them. 3 weeks into the Walsh brothers' trial period, Cedar Falls was struck by an unexpected catastrophe that would test every relationship and alliance Bear Thompson had carefully built. It began with what seemed like a routine autumn storm, but quickly escalated into something far more dangerous when the swollen Cedar Creek broke through its banks and flooded the lower section of town. The flood struck at 2 in the morning, when most residents were asleep and unprepared for the rushing water that swept through Main Street. Bear was awakened by frantic pounding on his hotel room door and shouts of "Flood! Everyone out!" echoing through the building. Within minutes, he was dressed and running through ankle-deep water toward Murphy's General Store, his first thought being the safety of the Walsh brothers sleeping in the room above. The street was chaos, residents wading through the rising water carrying hastily gathered possessions, children crying in their parents' arms, and the ominous sound of the creek's roar growing louder by the minute. He found the Walsh brothers already awake and organized. Timothy had roused his siblings the moment he heard the commotion outside, and they were helping Agnes Murphy move inventory from the store's lower shelves to higher ground. "Mr. Bear," Matthew called out, splashing through the shallow water inside the store. "Timothy said we should help Mrs. Murphy save her things." Bear felt a surge of pride watching the boys work together efficiently despite the emergency. Timothy and Michael were carrying heavy boxes of supplies upstairs, while Joseph and Peter formed a relay line passing smaller items between them. David was carefully wrapping breakable goods in cloth, and even little Matthew was contributing by organizing items as they reached safety. "Good thinking, boys," Bear said, joining their efforts. "Agnes, what's the situation?" Agnes Murphy's face was grim as she surveyed her flooded store. "Creek's higher than I've ever seen it. Old-timers say it could rise another 2 feet before it peaks. Lower part of town's already underwater, and it's still climbing." Through the store's windows, Bear could see the devastating scope of the flood. Martha Webb's restaurant was inundated, with tables and chairs floating in 3 feet of muddy water. Tom Fletcher's blacksmith shop was partially flooded, threatening his forge and expensive equipment. The train station platform, where he'd first discovered the Walsh brothers, was completely submerged. "Has anyone checked on the Hendersons?" Timothy asked, referring to an elderly couple who lived in a small cabin near the creek. Bear's blood chilled. In the chaos of securing property and helping immediate neighbors, he'd forgotten about residents who might be trapped in the flood's direct path. "No, son." "That's an excellent question." Agnes looked stricken. "Lord help us. I don't think anyone's been to check on them. Old Henry can barely walk, and Martha Henderson's been poorly all month." Without hesitation, Timothy began moving toward the door. "We should go help them." "Hold on there," Bear said, catching the boy's arm. "That's dangerous work. The current's getting stronger, and those cabins might not be safe to reach. But someone has to check on them," Michael insisted, supporting his brother's impulse. "They might need help getting to higher ground." Bear found himself facing a dilemma that crystallized everything he'd been trying to teach Cedar Falls about community responsibility. The Walsh brothers were demonstrating exactly the kind of selfless concern for others that marked truly valuable community members. But allowing children to participate in dangerous rescue work violated every protective instinct he possessed. The decision was made for him when Dr. Harrison burst through the store's front door. Water dripping from his coat and medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "Bear! Thank God you're here. We need every able-bodied person for rescue work. The Hendersons are trapped in their cabin. The Kowalski family is stranded on their roof, and there may be others we haven't accounted for." "What do you need?" Bear asked immediately. "Strong swimmers, people who know the area well, and anyone with boats or sturdy ropes. The sheriff's organizing rescue teams, but we're short on manpower." Timothy stepped forward again. "Dr. Harrison, we know this area well, and we're all strong swimmers. Our pa taught us in the creek during the summer." Dr. Harrison looked uncertainly at Bear. "These boys could be valuable help, but they're children," Bear finished. "And this is adult work, Mr. Bear," Joseph said quietly. "When the lumber mill flooded 2 years ago, Pa said everyone who could help had to help, even us kids. He said that's what community means, everyone doing what they can when people are in danger." The boy's words struck Bear powerfully. He'd been so focused on protecting the Walsh brothers that he'd almost forgotten the lesson he'd been trying to teach Cedar Falls, that every community member, regardless of age or circumstances, had valuable contributions to make. "All right," he decided. "But we work as a team with strict safety rules. No one goes anywhere alone, and if I say retreat, everyone retreats immediately." The rescue operation that followed became the defining moment of the Walsh brothers' integration into Cedar Falls. Working alongside Sheriff Morrison, Tom Fletcher, and other town leaders, they demonstrated courage, intelligence, and selflessness that impressed even their harshest critics. Timothy proved to be an exceptional leader during the crisis. When the rescue team reached the Henderson cabin, they found it surrounded by fast-moving water, too deep for the elderly couple to wade through safely. While the adults debated the safest approach, Timothy suggested a solution. "Michael and I could swim across with a rope," he proposed. "We're light enough that the current won't affect us as much, and we know how to read water from helping Pa with river crossings." Sheriff Morrison was skeptical. "Son, that's mighty dangerous water. One mistake and you could be swept downstream, but Mr. and Mrs. Henderson could die if we don't try," Timothy replied. "Sometimes you have to take risks to do what's right." The plan worked perfectly. Timothy and Michael successfully crossed the rushing water, secured the elderly couple, and helped guide them to safety using the rope line they'd established. Their success enabled the rescue of the Kowalski family and 2 other stranded residents, but the boys' heroism came at a personal cost. During the rescue of Mrs. Henderson, who was too weak to maintain her grip on the rope, Michael had stayed in the dangerous water longer than was safe to ensure her security. By the time they reached dry ground, he was hypothermic and exhausted. Dr. Harrison immediately took charge of Michael's care, wrapping him in blankets and administering treatment for exposure. The 12-year-old's condition was serious but not life-threatening, yet his sacrifice had not gone unnoticed by the adults who witnessed it. "That boy risked his life for an old woman he barely knows," Tom Fletcher said to Bear as they watched Dr. Harrison work. "That's the kind of character this town needs." Agnes Murphy, whose store had suffered significant flood damage, was even more direct. "Those boys have shown more community spirit in one night than some folks manage in a lifetime. Anyone who still questions their value to Cedar Falls is blind." But not everyone shared this positive assessment. As dawn broke and the immediate crisis passed, Ezra Caldwell arrived to survey the damage with several town council members. His reaction to learning about the Walsh brothers' role in the rescue operation was sharply critical. "You allowed children to participate in dangerous rescue work?" he demanded of Bear. "What if one of them had been seriously injured or killed?" The town would have been liable for allowing minors to engage in such reckless activities. Sheriff Morrison, who had worked directly with the boys during the rescue, defended their actions. "Ezra, those boys performed better than most adults would have. They followed orders, showed good judgment, and probably saved 3 lives. I'd work with them again without hesitation." "That's not the point," Caldwell insisted. "The point is that we're responsible for their welfare. Putting them in danger violates that responsibility regardless of the outcome." The argument highlighted a fundamental tension in how different residents viewed the Walsh brothers' place in the community. Those who had worked with them during the crisis saw capable young people who could contribute meaningfully to community welfare. Others continued to see them primarily as children who needed protection rather than partners in community life. The debate intensified when the full scope of the flood damage became clear. Martha Webb's restaurant would require weeks of cleanup and repair. Tom Fletcher's forge had suffered equipment damage that would cost significant money to replace. Agnes Murphy's store had lost hundreds of dollars worth of inventory to water damage. This disaster has strained our community's resources to the breaking point, Harold Morrison announced at an emergency town meeting called that afternoon. "We need to prioritize our recovery efforts and focus on essential needs." His implication was clear. Supporting 6 additional children was a luxury the town could no longer afford. The crisis that had revealed the Walsh brothers' value to some residents had simultaneously created economic pressures that made their continued presence seem burdensome to others. Bear found himself in the position of defending not just the boys' right to remain in Cedar Falls, but the entire principle of community responsibility for vulnerable members. "The flood didn't create our obligations to these children," he argued. "It revealed the strength of character that makes them valuable community members. Character doesn't rebuild flooded businesses or replace damaged equipment," Caldwell countered. "We need practical solutions to practical problems, not philosophical discussions about community values." The meeting grew heated as residents took sides. Those who had witnessed the boys' heroism during the rescue operation spoke passionately in their defense. Others, worried about their own flood losses, argued that the town couldn't afford additional burdens. Sarah Martinez, whose schoolhouse had been spared flood damage, made perhaps the most compelling argument for keeping the Walsh brothers. "These children have demonstrated exactly the qualities we want to encourage in our community: selflessness, courage, and genuine concern for others' welfare. Sending them away now would teach every child in Cedar Falls that heroism and community service don't matter as much as economic convenience." The debate raged for 3 hours without resolution. Finally, Bear stood to address the room, his massive frame commanding immediate attention. "Folks," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the crowded space, "this flood has shown us who we really are. It's revealed our strengths and our weaknesses, our generosity and our selfishness. The question we're really debating isn't whether we can afford to keep 6 children. It's whether we can afford to lose them." He gestured toward the Walsh brothers, who had been quietly listening to adults debate their fate. "These boys risked their lives tonight to save their neighbors. They didn't ask what was in it for them or whether they'd be rewarded. They saw people in danger and they acted. That's exactly the spirit this community needs to rebuild from this disaster." The room fell silent as residents absorbed Bear's words. The flood had indeed revealed character, both admirable and disappointing. The Walsh brothers had proven themselves under the most challenging circumstances possible. Now Cedar Falls had to prove itself worthy of them. As the meeting adjourned without a final decision, Bear knew that the real crisis wasn't the flood damage or the economic challenges. It was the community's struggle to define its own values in the face of adversity. The Walsh brothers had passed their most difficult test. The question that remained was whether Cedar Falls would pass its own. The week following the flood brought an unexpected development that would shift the entire dynamic of Cedar Falls' debate about the Walsh brothers. It began when a stranger arrived on the westbound train, carrying official-looking documents and asking pointed questions about 6 abandoned children who had reportedly been living on the train platform. Theodore Blackwood was a thin, officious man in his 40s, wearing an expensive Eastern suit that immediately marked him as an outsider in the frontier community. He carried himself with the self-important air of someone accustomed to wielding bureaucratic authority, and his first stop, after stepping off the train, was the sheriff's office. "I represent the Territorial Child Welfare Bureau," Blackwood announced to Sheriff Morrison, producing a leather portfolio filled with official papers. "I'm here to investigate reports of abandoned minors and to determine whether proper legal procedures have been followed regarding their placement." Sheriff Morrison, a practical man who had little patience for bureaucratic interference, examined the documents skeptically. "These children are being well cared for, Mr. Blackwood. They're not abandoned. They're under the protection of a responsible adult." "That may be," Blackwood replied, his tone suggesting he doubted it, "but the territory has established procedures for handling cases involving orphaned or abandoned children. These procedures exist to protect both the children and the communities that might be affected by their presence." The news of Blackwood's arrival spread through Cedar Falls within hours, creating immediate tension among residents who had been debating the Walsh brothers' future. Some saw his intervention as a solution to their dilemma, a way to transfer responsibility for the children to territorial authorities without appearing heartless. Others viewed it as an unwelcome intrusion into community affairs. Bear Thompson learned of Blackwood's presence when Agnes Murphy sent her nephew running to find him. "That government man's been asking questions about the boys," she reported breathlessly. "Says he might have to take them away to some territorial facility until proper arrangements can be made." Bear felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard about territorial child welfare facilities, overcrowded institutions where abandoned children were warehoused with minimal care, education, or hope for future placement. The idea of the Walsh brothers being sent to such a place was intolerable. Where is this Mr. Blackwood now? At the hotel, reviewing his papers and asking more questions. "He wants to interview the boys this afternoon." Bear found Blackwood in the hotel's small lobby, surrounded by documents and making notes in a leather-bound journal. The territorial agent looked up as Bear's massive frame filled the doorway, his expression shifting from bureaucratic confidence to visible unease. "Mr. Thompson, I presume," Blackwood said, rising to offer a perfunctory handshake. "I've been hearing quite a lot about your charitable endeavors. And I've been hearing about your interest in the Walsh boys," Bear replied evenly. "What exactly does the territory want with them?" Blackwood consulted his notes. "The territory of Wyoming has established clear protocols for dealing with abandoned or orphaned children. When such cases come to official attention, we're required to ensure that proper legal guardianship has been established and that the children are receiving appropriate care. These children are receiving excellent care." "Perhaps," Blackwood conceded, "but the arrangement appears to be entirely informal. No legal adoption papers, no formal guardianship proceedings, no oversight by qualified authorities. This creates liability issues for everyone involved." Bear studied the smaller man carefully. "What kind of liability? If these children are injured while under informal care, who bears responsibility? If they require expensive medical treatment, who pays? If they commit crimes or cause property damage, who is accountable? The current arrangement leaves too many questions unanswered, and what does the territory propose?" Blackwood opened his portfolio and extracted a thick sheaf of papers. "Temporary placement in the Territorial Children's Home in Cheyenne while we locate suitable permanent families. The facility provides adequate housing, basic education, and proper supervision until appropriate placements can be arranged." "How long does that process typically take?" "Depends on the children's ages and circumstances. Younger children are generally placed more quickly. Older boys," Blackwood shrugged, "sometimes they remain in institutional care until they reach maturity." Bear felt his anger rising, but kept his voice calm. So you're proposing to break up a family that's already been through tremendous hardship, separate brothers who've kept each other alive, and warehouse them in an institution that might never find them permanent homes. I'm proposing to follow established legal procedures designed to protect children's welfare, Blackwood replied stiffly. Your arrangement, however well-intentioned, lacks proper legal foundation. The confrontation might have escalated further, but Timothy Walsh chose that moment to enter the hotel lobby. The 14-year-old had been looking for Bear to discuss arrangements for his brother's afternoon work assignments, but stopped short when he saw the two men facing each other with obvious tension. Mr. Bear, Timothy said uncertainly. Is everything all right? Blackwood's attention immediately focused on the boy. You must be Timothy Walsh. I'm Theodore Blackwood from the Territorial Child Welfare Bureau. I'd like to speak with you and your brothers about your current living situation. Timothy's expression became wary. He'd developed keen instincts for reading adult intentions during his family's difficult period, and something about Blackwood's manner set off internal alarms. What kind of speaking, sir? Just questions about how you're being cared for, whether you're receiving proper education and supervision, that sort of thing. Standard procedure when children are placed in informal arrangements. Are you here to take us away? Timothy asked directly. Blackwood hesitated, clearly not expecting such a straightforward question from a 14-year-old. I'm here to ensure that you and your brothers are receiving appropriate care. If the current arrangement doesn't meet territorial standards, then alternatives might need to be considered. Timothy straightened to his full height, displaying the same dignity Bear had noticed on the train platform weeks earlier. Sir, Mr. Bear has given us the best care we've ever received. We're fed, housed, educated, and treated with respect. We're contributing to this community and planning for our futures. I don't understand what alternatives could be better than that. Young man, you may not fully understand the complexities involved. Legal guardianship provides protections that informal arrangements cannot offer. What I understand, Timothy replied with surprising firmness, is that bureaucrats who've never spent a night hungry or cold are trying to separate families that have learned to take care of each other. The boy's response clearly took Blackwood aback. He'd obviously expected to find either mistreated children grateful for rescue or naive youngsters easily convinced that institutional care would be in their best interests. Timothy's articulate defense of his current situation didn't fit either expectation. Nevertheless, Blackwood said, attempting to reassert his authority, territorial law requires proper procedures to be followed. I'll need to interview all 6 children and assess their current living conditions before making my recommendations. Bear recognized that opposing Blackwood directly might only strengthen the agent's determination to remove the boys. A different approach was needed. Mr. Blackwood, would you be willing to observe these children in their daily activities before conducting formal interviews? See how they're actually living, rather than just reviewing paperwork? Blackwood considered the suggestion. I suppose that would be appropriate. A comprehensive assessment should include observation of the children's actual circumstances. Then let me show you what the Walsh brothers have accomplished in Cedar Falls. What followed was a tour that revealed the depth of the boys' integration into community life. At the schoolhouse, Sarah Martinez demonstrated the academic progress each boy had made, showing Blackwood samples of their work and explaining how they'd been helping other students with their lessons. Timothy has been assisting me with the younger children's reading instruction, Sarah explained. Michael's mathematical abilities have enabled him to help several students who were struggling with arithmetic. All of them show genuine love of learning and contribute positively to our classroom environment. At Tom Fletcher's blacksmith shop, the agent observed Peter working carefully with heated metal while David organized tools with the precision of someone who understood their importance. Tom spoke enthusiastically about their potential as craftsmen and their consistent reliability. These boys show up on time, follow safety procedures, and ask intelligent questions. Tom told Blackwood. "They're not just learning trades, they're developing work ethics that will serve them throughout their lives." At Martha Webb's restaurant, Blackwood witnessed Timothy and Michael serving customers with professional competence that impressed even the agent's critical eye. Their interactions with difficult customers showed maturity and social skills that contradicted stereotypes about institutionalized children, but it was the boys' response to a minor crisis that most effectively demonstrated their value to the community. When elderly Mrs. Patterson slipped on the restaurant's wet floor and injured her ankle, the Walsh brothers immediately coordinated to help her. Timothy assessed her condition and sent Joseph running for Dr. Harrison, while Michael helped her to a chair and David brought ice for the swelling. These boys respond to emergencies like trained medical assistants, Dr. Harrison observed as he examined Mrs. Patterson's ankle. They've clearly been taught to think about others' welfare before their own convenience. Blackwood watched these interactions with growing uncertainty about his original assessment. The children he observed bore little resemblance to the abandoned waifs he'd expected to find. They were confident, capable, and clearly valued by the adults around them. The turning point came during his interview with little Matthew. The 4-year-old, the most vulnerable of the brothers, had been carefully prepared for the meeting by Timothy, who explained that the nice man just wanted to make sure they were happy and safe. "Matthew," Blackwood said, attempting to use a gentle tone, "can you tell me about where you live and who takes care of you?" "We live upstairs from Mrs. Murphy's store," Matthew replied matter-of-factly. "Timothy takes care of us, and Mr. Bear makes sure we have everything we need, and Mrs. Webb gives us good food, and Dr. Harrison checks to make sure we're healthy." "And are you happy here?" Matthew's face lit up with genuine joy. "Oh, yes. We have warm beds and plenty to eat, and I'm learning to read, and Peter's teaching me about hammers and metal, and everyone's really nice to us." "Do you miss your father?" The question brought a more subdued response. "I miss Papa, but Timothy says he'll come back when he can. Until then, we have lots of people who care about us here. What if I told you there was a nice place where you could live with other children while we look for a permanent family for you?" Matthew considered this seriously. "Would my brothers come too?" "Well, that would depend on various factors. Then I don't want to go," Matthew said firmly. "My brothers are my family. We take care of each other. I don't need other children. I need Timothy and Michael and Joseph and Peter and David." The 4-year-old's simple statement of loyalty hit Blackwood harder than any adult argument could have. Here was a child who had found security and love in his current situation and saw no reason to trade it for the uncertainty of institutional placement. As Blackwood prepared to leave Cedar Falls the following morning, he faced a decision that would affect not just 6 children, but the entire community's understanding of what was possible when people chose to care for each other. His report to territorial authorities would either validate the innovative arrangement Bear Thompson had created or destroy it in favor of bureaucratic conformity. The choice would reveal whether institutional procedures could adapt to accommodate successful informal solutions, or whether the rigidity of territorial welfare systems would triumph over the flexibility of community care. For the Walsh brothers, everything they had built in Cedar Falls hung in the balance of one man's assessment of whether love and community commitment could substitute for official paperwork and institutional oversight. The future they had dared to hope for was now entirely in the hands of a territorial bureaucrat who had never expected to find abandoned children thriving rather than merely surviving. Theodore Blackwood spent his final evening in Cedar Falls in his hotel room, reviewing notes and wrestling with a decision that would affect far more than just 6 children. The territorial regulations were clear. Abandoned minors should be placed in official custody until proper legal arrangements could be made. But the reality he'd observed in Cedar Falls challenged every assumption those regulations were based on. His telegraph to territorial headquarters that evening was brief but significant. "Request extension for Walsh case evaluation. Circumstances warrant additional review before final determination. The response came within hours. Extension granted. Thorough documentation required for any deviation from standard procedures. While Blackwood pondered his official report, the Walsh brothers were dealing with their own crisis of uncertainty. The possibility of being separated and sent to an institution had shaken their carefully rebuilt sense of security, forcing them to confront fears they'd tried to suppress since their father's departure. "What if they split us up?" David asked during their nightly gathering in the room above Murphy's store. "What if they decide the little ones need different care than the older ones?" Timothy, who had been trying to maintain optimism for his brother's sake, finally allowed his own fears to show. "I don't know, David. I've been thinking about it all day, and I don't have good answers." "Maybe we should run away before he makes his decision," suggested Joseph. "We survived on our own before. We could do it again." "And go where?" Michael asked practically. "Winter's coming, we don't have supplies, and now we'd be fugitives from territorial authorities. That would make everything worse." Little Matthew, who had been quietly listening, spoke up with the directness that only young children possess. "Why don't we just ask Mr. Bear to be our real papa? Then that man couldn't take us away." The suggestion hung in the air, like a challenge to everything the boys had been assuming about their situation. They'd accepted Bear's protection and care, but had never considered the possibility of formal adoption. In their minds, they were still waiting for their father's return, existing in a temporary arrangement that could be disrupted at any moment. "Bear's not family," Timothy said slowly. "He's been good to us, but that doesn't make him our father. He's been more of a father to us than Pa was in the last year before he left," Michael replied quietly. "I know that sounds disloyal, but it's true. Bear's fed us, protected us, made sure we had medical care and education. Isn't that what fathers are supposed to do?" The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on their door. Bear Thompson entered, his massive frame somehow managing to convey both strength and gentleness as he surveyed the 6 boys gathered around their small table. "I thought you might be having trouble sleeping," he said, settling into the room's single chair, which creaked under his weight. "This situation with Mr. Blackwood has everyone unsettled. Mr. Bear," Timothy asked directly, "what happens if he decides to take us away?" Bear had been dreading this conversation, but he'd learned that these boys deserved honest answers rather than false reassurances. "I'll fight it through every legal channel available. But if territorial authorities are determined to assert custody, my options might be limited." "Unless you adopted us officially," Matthew said with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used with Blackwood. "Then you'd be our real papa and they couldn't take us." Bear felt his throat tighten. The idea had occurred to him, but he'd dismissed it as presumptuous. These boys had a father, even if he'd abandoned them. Taking legal steps to replace that relationship seemed like both an overreach and a betrayal of their family bonds. "Son, adoption is a serious legal step that would make me your father permanently. That's not something to decide lightly, especially when your real father might still return." "Our real father left us on a train platform," Michael said with painful honesty. "We've been pretending he's coming back because it hurts too much to accept that he's not. But deep down, we all know the truth," Timothy nodded slowly. "Pa did what he thought he had to do, but he's not coming back. If he was, he would have returned by now or at least sent word. We need to stop waiting for something that isn't going to happen." Bear studied each boy's face, seeing a maturity that poverty and abandonment had forced upon them too early. They weren't children clinging to fantasy. They were young people making pragmatic assessments of their situation and taking responsibility for their own futures. "Are you saying you'd want me to pursue legal adoption?" Bear asked carefully. "We're saying we'd be honored to have you as our father," Timothy replied with formal dignity. "Not because we need rescuing, but because you've shown us what a real father should be." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Bear had experienced in his 47 years. 6 children ranging from a 4-year-old to a teenager. discussed with remarkable sophistication what it would mean to choose their own family rather than simply accepting the circumstances they'd been born into. "If you adopted us, would we take your name?" Peter asked. "If that's what you wanted," Bear replied, "though you might prefer to keep your own name to honor your mother's memory." "What about when we're grown up?" David wondered. "Would we still be your sons?" "Family doesn't end when children become adults," Bear explained. "If I adopted you, you'd be my sons forever, just like if you'd been born to me." Joseph raised a practical concern. "Would you expect us to stay in Cedar Falls always? Or could we go to college or travel or start our own families?" "Son, the whole point of raising children is to prepare them to build their own lives. I'd expect you to become independent, successful men who can take care of themselves and contribute to whatever communities you choose to join." The discussion continued until well past midnight, covering everything from inheritance rights to family responsibilities to what they would call Bear if he became their legal father. The boys' questions revealed both their practical intelligence and their genuine affection for the man who had rescued them from starvation and despair. "There's one more thing we need to consider," Bear said as the conversation wound down. "Adopting 6 children at once is unusual enough that it might complicate Blackwood's decision. He might view it as an attempt to circumvent territorial authority rather than a genuine family arrangement." "Then we need to convince him it's genuine," Timothy said. "We need to show him that this isn't just about avoiding institutional placement, it's about creating a real family." "How do we do that?" Michael had an idea. "What if we wrote letters? Each of us explaining why we want you to be our father, not just our guardian? Something he could read and understand, that this isn't just convenience or fear." The suggestion sparked immediate enthusiasm from his brothers. Over the next hour, each boy composed a letter to Theodore Blackwood, explaining in their own words why they wanted Bear Thompson to adopt them. The letters, written in careful handwriting on paper Sarah Martinez had provided, revealed depths of feeling and understanding that surprised even Bear. Timothy's letter focused on leadership and responsibility. "Mr. Blackwood, being the oldest, I've tried to take care of my brothers since Ma died. But I've learned that being a good leader means knowing when to let someone more experienced take charge. Mr. Bear has shown me what it means to protect people not just from danger, but from hopelessness. I want him to be my father because he's taught me what kind of man I want to become." Michael wrote about education and opportunity. "Before Mr. Bear found us, I thought being smart was just something that made me different from other kids. He's shown me that intelligence is a tool for helping others and building better communities. I want to learn everything I can so I can someday help other children the way he's helped us." Joseph's letter emphasized community contribution. "I used to think work was just something you had to do to survive. Mr. Bear has taught me that work is how you show respect for the people who depend on you. I want to be his son because he's shown me that being useful to others is the best way to be proud of yourself." Peter focused on craftsmanship and skill. "Mr. Fletcher says I have good hands for working with metal and wood, but Mr. Bear taught me that having skill isn't enough. You have to use it to make things that help people. I want him to be my father because he understands that making beautiful, useful things is a way of taking care of the world." David's letter revealed artistic sensitivity. "Mr. Bear noticed that I like to draw pictures and that I see things differently than other people. He said that's not something to hide but something to develop. I want him to adopt me because he makes me feel like being different is good." Not bad. Little Matthew's letter, dictated to Timothy but expressing his own thoughts, was perhaps the most moving. "Mr. Bear is warm and safe, and he never gets angry when I have bad dreams. He makes sure I eat good food and he reads me stories. I want him to be my papa because he already takes care of me like papas are supposed to do." As dawn approached, Bear gathered the 6 letters and prepared to confront Theodore Blackwood with a formal adoption proposal. The territorial agent's decision would determine not just the boy's immediate future, but whether an unconventional family born of necessity and nurtured by love could survive the scrutiny of bureaucratic authority. The letters represented more than just appeals for favorable treatment. They were declarations of independence from circumstances beyond their control and assertions of their right to choose their own family bonds. 6 children who had been abandoned by traditional family structures were creating new definitions of what family could mean. Bear Thompson, who had lived alone in the mountains for 15 years, was about to discover whether a solitary man could officially become the father of 6 sons, and whether love and commitment could overcome the legal obstacles that stood between them and permanent family security. The decision that would reshape all their lives was just hours away, and everything they had built together in Cedar Falls would either be validated by official recognition or destroyed by institutional inflexibility. For the Walsh brothers, the next few hours would determine whether they would remain together as a family or be scattered across territorial institutions. Their bonds severed by regulations that valued procedural correctness over human connections. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would test everything Cedar Falls had learned about community, responsibility, and the true meaning of family. Theodore Blackwood's meeting with Bear Thompson the following morning took place in the hotel's small dining room, where the territorial agent had spread his documents across 2 tables like a general planning a campaign. The 6 letters from the Walsh brothers lay beside his official forms, their careful handwriting a stark contrast to the bureaucratic typography of government paperwork. "Mr. Thompson," Blackwood began, his tone more thoughtful than authoritative, "I've spent considerable time reviewing this case, and I find myself in an unusual position. The regulations are clear about proper procedures for abandoned children, but the circumstances here challenge the assumptions those regulations were designed to address." Bear settled into a chair that protested under his weight, his expression carefully neutral. "What have you decided?" "I've decided that sometimes the spirit of the law matters more than the letter of it," Blackwood replied, touching the stack of children's letters. "These boys have written some of the most compelling arguments for family placement I've encountered in 15 years of territorial service. More importantly, they've demonstrated integration into community life that exceeds anything our institutional facilities could provide." Bear felt a surge of cautious hope. "Are you saying you'll approve the adoption?" "I'm saying I'll recommend it to territorial authorities, with conditions." Blackwood pulled out a fresh document. "Formal adoption proceedings must be filed within 30 days. Regular progress reports must be submitted to my office for the first year. And most importantly, the boys must demonstrate continued academic progress and community contribution. Those conditions seem reasonable." "There's one more requirement," Blackwood continued. "This case has attracted attention at the territorial level because it represents a new approach to child welfare. If successful, it could influence policy throughout Wyoming Territory. I'll need comprehensive documentation of how this arrangement develops, particularly regarding the boys' education and community integration." Bear understood the implications. The Walsh brothers' success or failure would affect how territorial authorities handled similar cases in the future. Their adoption would become a test case for whether community-based solutions could replace institutional care for abandoned children. "We'll provide whatever documentation you need," Bear promised. "These boys deserve the chance to prove what's possible when children receive proper support and opportunity." The adoption proceedings that followed took place in Cedar Falls' small courthouse, presided over by Territorial Judge Harrison Whitmore, who had traveled from Cheyenne specifically for the unusual case. The courtroom was packed with residents who had followed the Walsh brothers' story from their arrival through the flood rescue to the current legal proceedings. Judge Whitmore, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, had reviewed Blackwood's recommendations and the extensive documentation of the boy's progress in Cedar Falls. His questions were thorough but sympathetic, designed to ensure that both Bear and the children understood the permanent nature of the commitment they were making. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Whitmore began, "adoption of 6 children simultaneously is highly unusual. Are you prepared for the financial, educational, and emotional responsibilities this arrangement will entail?" "Your Honor, I've been preparing for those responsibilities since the day I found these boys. The only difference now is making the arrangement legal and permanent. And boys," the judge addressed the Walsh brothers directly, "do you understand that adoption means Mr. Thompson will become your father in every legal sense? Your name, your inheritance rights, your family identity will all change permanently," Timothy answered for his brothers with the dignity that had impressed every adult who'd worked with him. "Your Honor, Mr. Bear has already been our father in every way that matters. The legal papers will just make official what's already true in our hearts." The judge's stern expression softened slightly. "These are mature words from a young man. I hope your actions will continue to reflect that maturity." "They will, sir. We all understand how much Mr. Bear has sacrificed for us, and we're determined to prove worthy of his investment." The formal proceedings took less than an hour, but their impact would resonate through Cedar Falls for generations. When Judge Whitmore pronounced the adoption final, declaring Bear Thompson the legal father of Timothy, Michael, Joseph, Peter, David, and Matthew Thompson, the courtroom erupted in applause that reflected the community's investment in the family's success. But the real significance of the moment was revealed in the years that followed. As the 6 Thompson boys grew into men who exemplified everything Bear had hoped to teach them about responsibility, community service, and moral character, Timothy Thompson became Cedar Falls' youngest mayor at age 24, implementing innovative policies that attracted new families and businesses to the growing community. His leadership during the economic expansion of the early 1900s established Cedar Falls as a model for sustainable frontier development. He married Sarah Martinez, the teacher who had first assessed his academic abilities, and together they raised 4 children who inherited their parents' commitment to education and community service. Michael Thompson fulfilled his early promise in mathematics and engineering, eventually designing water management systems that served communities throughout Wyoming Territory. His innovations in flood control, inspired by the crisis that had helped establish his family's place in Cedar Falls, saved countless lives and property. He established a scholarship fund that enabled dozens of frontier children to attend college, ensuring that economic circumstances wouldn't prevent talented young people from pursuing higher education. Joseph Thompson became a successful businessman whose ventures created hundreds of jobs throughout the region. But his true legacy lay in his insistence that every enterprise he established prioritize worker welfare and community benefit alongside profit. His companies were known for their safety standards, fair wages, and contributions to local infrastructure projects. Peter Thompson mastered the blacksmithing skills Tom Fletcher had taught him, eventually expanding into mechanical engineering and manufacturing. His workshops became training centers where young people learned not just technical skills, but work ethics and quality standards that served them throughout their careers. The Thompson Manufacturing Company became Wyoming's largest employer while maintaining the family-centered values Bear had instilled. David Thompson's artistic talents flourished under the encouragement he'd received. In Cedar Falls, his paintings and sculptures celebrated frontier life and the natural beauty of Wyoming Territory. But his most important work was establishing art education programs in schools throughout the region. He believed that every child deserved the chance to express creativity and see beauty in the world around them. Matthew Thompson, the youngest, perhaps traveled furthest from his origins. He became a physician specializing in pediatric care, dedicating his life to ensuring that no child suffered the neglect and abandonment he had experienced. Dr. Matthew Thompson established children's hospitals in Denver, Salt Lake City, and Seattle, each operating on principles of community support and comprehensive care that reflected the lessons learned in Cedar Falls. But their individual successes, impressive as they were, mattered less than their collective impact on how American communities approached child welfare and family support. The Thompson family's story became a case study in universities and government agencies, demonstrating that community-based solutions could succeed where institutional approaches had failed. Bear Thompson lived to see his 6 sons become successful men who never forgot their obligations to others. He died peacefully in 1923 at age 78, surrounded by his sons, their wives, and a crowd of grandchildren who called him Papa Bear and listened with fascination to stories of the night their fathers had been rescued from a train platform. His funeral drew mourners from across the American West, former students of Timothy's educational programs, workers whose lives had been improved by Joseph's employment practices, families whose homes had been saved by Michael's flood control systems, young artists inspired by David's teaching, and countless children whose health had been protected by Matthew's medical innovations. The eulogy was delivered by Theodore Blackwood, now retired from territorial service, but still remembered as the bureaucrat who had chosen compassion over procedure. Bear Thompson proved that family isn't just about blood relationships, Blackwood said. It's about commitment, sacrifice, and the choice to love children who need parents more than they need official documentation. The legacy of that October morning in 1892, when Bear Thompson discovered 6 brothers fighting for survival on a train platform, extended far beyond one family's success story. It demonstrated that abandoned children could become community leaders, that informal families could be stronger than traditional ones, and that small frontier towns could develop innovative solutions to social problems that challenged larger, more established communities. Cedar Falls itself grew into a prosperous city of over 15,000 residents by 1920. Its success, built largely on the principles Bear Thompson and the Walsh brothers had established during those crucial months of trial and acceptance. The community's commitment to ensuring that no child was left behind became a defining characteristic that attracted families from throughout the region. The train platform where the brothers had once fought over breadcrumbs was preserved as a historical site, with a bronze plaque that read, "Here 6 abandoned children were discovered by Samuel Bear Thompson on October 15, 1892. Their rescue became the foundation of a community commitment to ensure that every child has the opportunity to thrive. No child gets left behind." But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Bear Thompson's legacy was the simple fact that Cedar Falls never again allowed a child to go hungry, homeless, or forgotten. The systems he had helped establish, community-supported education, cooperative childcare, and shared responsibility for vulnerable members, became so integrated into the town's culture that future generations considered them natural and inevitable rather than revolutionary. The story of the mountain man who rescued 6 brothers from a train platform became a legend told throughout the American West, inspiring countless other communities to reconsider their own obligations to abandoned and vulnerable children. It proved that heroes weren't always found in dramatic rescues or military victories, but sometimes in the simple decision to see potential where others saw only problems. Samuel Bear Thompson had kept his promise that no child would be left behind, but his true achievement was teaching an entire community to make that same promise, ensuring that his legacy would continue long after his own story had ended. The 6 boys who had once fought over scraps became men who fed others. The community that had once debated whether it could afford to help became a place where helping others was considered not a burden, but a privilege. And the mountain man who had lived alone for 15 years discovered that the greatest families aren't born. They're chosen, nurtured, and built through love, commitment, and an unwavering belief that every child deserves the chance to become everything they're capable of being. In the end, Bear Thompson's legacy wasn't just about rescuing 6 children. It was about proving that when communities choose compassion over convenience and love over fear, they create possibilities that regulations and institutions can never achieve alone. The train platform in Cedar Falls stood empty now, but it was no longer a place where children were abandoned. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys begin not when you board a train, but when someone decides you're worth saving. No child gets left behind. It had started as one man's promise to 6 desperate boys. It became a community's commitment to its own soul. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.